So good morning and thank you for joining us for today's press conference on the Mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2020 and 2021. My name is Eileen Park and I am the Director of Communications for Mayor Wheeler, and today we are joined by Mayor Wheeler and City Budget Director Jessica Kinard, our main speakers for today's press conference. After they speak, we will open it up for a Q&A, and available to answer questions will be Mayor Wheeler, City Budget Director Jessica Kinard, City Economist Josh Harwood, as well as Chief Human Resource Officer Cathy Bless. Now, to the members of the media, please make sure that your Zoom handle reflects your organization and your name. If it doesn't, you will likely have to sign off and sign back on with the revised name, so please take a few seconds to do so. Okay, so with that, let's begin with Mayor Ted Wheeler. Mayor.
Thank you, Eileen. Crisis reveals the true character of a city. And what we've discovered is a city budget that will be able to largely withstand the economic blow of this crisis because of a strong foundation of fiscal responsibility and good stewardship of taxpayer dollars. In the last few years, we as a city council made difficult, but I believe strong financial choices. We saved money and we put it aside to handle known and unknown long-term expenses. While the long-term needs for those dollars still exist, we were able to redirect those dollars to meet immediate critical needs for today. That doesn't mean there won't be more difficult decisions to make, and the forecast could of course shift again. And it might get worse before it gets better. But it does mean that we're in a stronger position than many cities around the country, and that's because of strong financial management in the last few years. Since COVID-19 began, I've witnessed the true strength and resiliency of our great city. Just think about what happened. Portlanders, along with many around the world, have been suddenly and deeply hurt financially, socially, and emotionally. But as a society, something else happened too. We discovered deep and meaningful connections in ways we never imagined. And in direct result of this pandemic, we're witnessing a global shift of the ways things have always been done. We get to write a new story. We get to set a new foundation, a foundation that puts fiscal resiliency, climate action, equity, and the needs of our most vulnerable populations front and center of every budget decision we make. It's given us a chance to rethink the way we do business, to improve our process, to improve our city, which brings me to my proposed budget for this year. I'll say this is unlike any budget I've ever produced. Who could have imagined, even just a few months ago, that the very foundational structures of our society would be challenged? But here's the thing. Some structures that existed before need to be challenged. There's deep inequity in our society, and it's only been exacerbated by COVID-19. But they don't have to continue. While we had to make some difficult decisions, you're going to see how we will still be able to support our frontline communities who've been hit first and worst by the pandemic. So let's dive right in. Let's begin with the facts. We know from our economist, Josh Harwood, that the reduction in the forecast is up to $75 million for the next fiscal year. So my team and I, along with the City Budget Office, identified $59 million in savings from city reserves, set-asides, pulling back underspending, and pushing pause on a few programs. We overturned every stone, looked for every opportunity to close the gap with minimal disruption in service to the community. By identifying $59 million in savings means one big thing: critical core services are able to continue. You already know this. The City of Portland employees respond to hundreds of thousands of calls every year for emergency services. They take care of our water needs, our parks, our roads, just to name a few things. They're the ones that we call when we're in crisis. They're the ones upholding the safety of the public. They keep the city running. But closing this large financial gap, despite the reserves, was by no means an easy task. we had to make some really tough decisions. We instituted wage freezes and furlough requirements. We drew down our contingency fund as well as a variety of reserves and set-asides, money that the city had been responsibly and appropriately saving for critical uses, but money that we can't afford to leave sitting idle when we're in a time of crisis. We pulled back money that was budgeted for this current fiscal year, but hasn't yet been spent, that probably would have stayed right where it was and rolled over into the next year. But that still left us with closing a $29 million gap. So I've called for a 5.6% reduction in general fund discretionary resources across city bureaus. Different bureaus are burdened by these cuts differently. To ensure fairness across bureaus, I'm individually crediting bureaus' budgets for these reductions towards their 5.6% cut target. Together, these efforts achieve an additional $19.6 million in savings. Among the cuts that will need to be taken in each bureau to meet the cut target, this budget relies on cuts to personnel compensation. In order to avoid layoffs, I've asked our labor partners to share in the sacrifices that others are already taking. However, if we're unable to reach an agreement, bureaus will be faced with addressing a nearly $9 million general fund gap with layoffs. I'm confident and hopeful that we'll be able to come to an agreement soon with our labor partners. Those conversations are ongoing and they've been going well. We need all the help we can get, and that includes additional federal resources, which we're pushing hard for. Now, let's talk about what we're funding and why my proposed budget puts front and center fiscal resiliency, equity, the need of our most vulnerable populations, and achieving our climate goals at the heart of every budget decision I make. This budget provides a platform for fiscal stability, but it still elevates equity and inclusion. It still supports frontline communities hit hardest by COVID-19, and at the same time rolls back the inequities that have plagued our city in past years. Let's begin with our most vulnerable population, the houseless, and why it's never been more critical to support them to stay off the streets and get them on the path to stability. That's why, in my proposed budget, I'm preserving current funding levels for the Joint Office of Homeless Services. Our houseless neighbors are at an increased risk during this crisis. The work of the Joint Office is critical in this effort to staff shelters and get as many people off the streets as we possibly can. Next, we're investing in organizations that serve undocumented Portlanders. We're also providing critical rent assistance. We're supporting organizations that respond to and prevent hate crimes. We preserve funding for programs that work with domestic violence survivors. We allocated new cannabis fund resources to support small businesses and specifically earmarked funds to support women and minority-owned businesses. We're investing in the city's green fleet transition and the building of a cleaner and greener construction industry. We're investing and leading regional efforts to improve air quality through clean air construction standards. This is, of course, in addition to protecting and supporting our core services around public safety, maintaining our utilities, our roads, and other important services. My proposed budget also supports another key community priority, Portland Parks and Recreation. Last year, Commissioner Nick Fish led the council, the Bureau, and the community through a very difficult realization about the Bureau's unsustainable business model and began the work to resolve it. Thanks to Nick and Director Adina Long's team, Parks and Rec was on track to end this year in good shape and to be heading towards a more sustainable future. When COVID-19 entered the mix, Parks and Rec acted swiftly and responsibly to close community centers and pools and to suspend recreation programming. But that means popular summer programming like free movies and concerts through Summer Free for All will look different or be canceled this year. It also means that nearly 1,000 seasonal and casual employees were laid off or not hired this year, and those valued employees are without jobs for the summer. Portlanders justifiably love their parks and recreation system, and I'm committed to finding and funding a sustainable future for Portland Parks and Recreation. They've also stepped up in creative ways to support the most vulnerable in our community during the COVID-19 crisis. 3 community centers are serving as temporary shelters, and summer programming will focus on getting meals to hungry kids. This is just an example of how the city is adjusting and adapting to the crisis with flexibility and a sense of urgency. If there's one thing you remember from today, let it be this: our world was turned upside down by COVID-19. And as a result, we were facing what looked like a free fall of drastic cuts across the board, a sudden $75 million less in general fund revenue, at least. But what happened? Thanks to the last few years of strong financial management, we closed almost 90% of that gap through this budget, nearly 90%. We turned around the expected free fall. We turned around what was supposed to be a bleak, dire forecast into a budget that still protects the most vulnerable in our community, and at the same time charts a visionary future, one that provides a solid foundation for the city's recovery from the COVID crisis, while simultaneously keeping core city services running for all Portlanders, and leads the city on a path of supporting all communities and prioritizing climate action. This was an inequitable society before COVID-19. We know that. And COVID-19 is exacerbating those inequities. And that's why it's so important for us to be intentional about addressing those inequities. It's not going to be easy, but we're going to fight with everything we've got to make sure that those inequities don't continue. I said this before, but it bears repeating. I'm proud of our city, our public servants, and our community. I'm privileged to serve as your mayor. Over the last couple of months, I've been inspired and humbled by the excellent work of those around me, our council offices who've helped us and worked with us on this budget, Jessica Kinard and the entire budget office, the team leading our COVID-19 response, bureau directors who are in constant communication with our team and working together to solve problems, and every single one of our public servants keeping critical services alive. We're going to get through this, and we're going to come out stronger. And we're already showing that we, as a city government, can be cost-effective and be visionary. This is our chance to create a more inclusive, equitable, and resilient Portland, working together as one city. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Now, our City Budget Director, Jessica Kinard, joins us to talk about the overall budget. Hi, Jessica.
Thank you, Eileen. As you just heard from the mayor, we are in highly unusual and uncertain times financially and budgetarily. I'm going to share a brief presentation to walk you through how things have changed in the wake of COVID-19 and how the mayor's budget adjusts to this new reality. So this chart shows the many steps in our typical budget calendar for the City of Portland's annual budget process. We typically plan for the adoption of the annual budget over an 8-month-long period. This process is long because we want budget development to be thoughtful, accurate, and informed. However, this year with the COVID-19 crisis, we have had to adjust rapidly to a new and emerging financial reality. When we started the budget process for the upcoming fiscal year back in September, we were optimistic about the year to come. The mayor released his initial budget guidance with no general fund cuts for the first time in years. The mayor's guidance also allowed bureaus to request new general fund resources and directed bureaus to collaborate on a number of key priority areas as listed on this slide. Our general fund forecast as of February 2020, just a few short months ago, included a total of $28.5 million in anticipated new general fund discretionary resources. You can see on this chart that we anticipated about $4.5 million of that resource to be available for ongoing needs and $24 million for one-time needs. I want to highlight here that what we're talking about in this presentation is only the city's discretionary resource, which typically accounts for around 10 to 13% of the city's total budget. Then the COVID-19 crisis happened and our financial picture changed suddenly and dramatically. That financial picture is still very much evolving, but we had to balance the budget to this new reality. As a result, our city economist, Josh Harwood, provided the council with an updated forecast on April 21st to reflect a $75 million reduction in discretionary resource. This represents about a 13% decline in the city's discretionary general fund. Additionally, impacts are being felt across the city and across our funds, most notably in the Bureau of Transportation. This chart shows how the mayor balanced to this sudden new reality. The blue on the left side of this chart shows the reductions included in the mayor's proposed budget, while the green on the right shows the limited priority net adds that were included. You will find in the pages of the mayor's proposed budget book that several more adds were supported than what is shown on this slide. This is because the slide represents the allocation of new discretionary resources, and the mayor's proposed budget includes adds that are supported by carryover from the current fiscal year, as well as adds supported by non-discretionary resources. You can see that the largest net add is for continuity of homeless services, followed by supporting bargain labor agreements with our public safety frontline workers. You can also see adds for ADA curb cuts, park service, and support for other critical priorities, such as revenue collection efforts and climate action. On the left side, you see the reductions. Going from the center left, you see the first solution was to eliminate that $28.5 million in forecasted revenues. Next, the mayor's budget draws upon reserves and set-asides to generate $17.1 million in savings, and then identifies current year underspending for an additional $13.8 million. These three categories are how the mayor reduced $59 million without impacting current services or employees. The final left three bars the final left three bars are solutions which require Bureau assistance and represent that $29 million funding gap, or what equates to that 5.6% budget cut that the mayor referred to in his presentation. The mayor's budget assumes citywide cost containment strategies, the $16.4 million bar here. This includes wage freezes, furloughs, and materials and service inflationary reductions to generate $16.4 million in discretionary savings. There are also a handful of program-specific reductions that the mayor's budget assumes, generating an additional $3.2 million in savings. This all leaves the balance, that final $9.3 million, for which bureaus are being directed to bring forward reduction proposals as part of our fall supplemental budget process. I'll now turn it back over to Eileen.
Jessica, thank you so much. Now we will open it up for questions to the media. And members of the media, please remember to use the raise the hand function on Zoom, and I will call on you. And please tell us the publication you're working for and who the question is for. Now, remember, in addition to Mayor Wheeler and City Budget Director Jessica Kinard, we also have City Economist Josh Harwood, as well as Chief Human Resource Officer Cathy Bless. Okay, so to answer questions, we will now look on the panelist portion of Zoom for our first question. Okay, I see Maggie Vespa. Maggie?
Guys, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, Maggie Vespa with KGW. Mayor Wheeler, can you speak to the staff reductions that you're asking bureaus to make? Any guidance that you're giving them, for people listening, both who are in those positions and then members of the public who are wondering what impacts they may see from that, just kind of your message on those topics.
So at every step of this, thank you, Maggie, for the question. At every step of this budget, we have sought to do everything we can to minimize the reduction of services, particularly critical services to the community. And we have worked very hard to preserve as many of the jobs as possible for our fellow employees. And obviously, We directed a number of across the board freezes for non-represented employees that included cost of living adjustments, merit increases. We mandated furloughs. None of those things cost anybody their job, but they do require sacrifice on the part of our employees. We're also asking our represented employees through their labor union leadership to reach parity with those same sacrifices that have been demonstrated by non-represented employees. We don't yet have the commitments in place from those labor union leaders, but the conversations are going well. It's my understanding that if we are not able to achieve some sort of an agreement around cost of living and around step increases for our represented employees, that would require us to find an approximately additional $9 million in savings. The goal here is really to get through the immediate crisis, the immediate economic crisis, the immediate budget crisis, and keep our services and our employment base intact as much as possible.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Maggie. Next, we have Alex Zielinski with the Mercury. Hi, Alex.
Hello. I see that there's a big chunk of money committed to public safety unions and being able to negotiate deals and contracts with those frontline workers. I'm curious on that note, what the status is of the current negotiations with the Portland Police Association. I know the contract's about to expire, and I'm curious if that's planning on being extended, that current contract, or where those conversations are right now.
So Alex, to answer those labor questions, the mayor as well as Cathy Bless are available. So do you want both of them to speak to that, or do you want one?
Sure, both would be great.
Mayor, do you want to begin?
Well, first of all, the negotiations are ongoing. Obviously, with the COVID crisis, that caused both the labor representatives as well as the mayor's office and the Bureau of Human Resources to take a pause so that we could address the immediate fiscal crisis around this budget. We're engaged with the PPA and PPCOA, along with all of the other represented employees, in trying to figure out how to minimize the impact both on our employees and frontline services. Those conversations will continue. And Cathy, you probably have something more formal to add.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, we have been in communication with PPA, working with council, and still understanding, related to the police contract, the importance of that public feedback and the public process that we have committed to. During this crisis, it is incredibly important that we provide opportunities for the public to still participate in the PPA contract process. We have not had any additional negotiations since the start of the COVID crisis, but we are definitely working with the mayor's office and with the PPA to ensure that the commitments that we have all have in an open process do continue. The timeline at this moment is unsure.
Okay, thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Mayor.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, does that answer your question? You see, you have another hand raised, so maybe you have a follow-up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I just, another question about union conversations. Mayor, you mentioned that there are conversations with different city represented unions is kind of going to determine the amount of savings you're going to be able to make. What's the time frame for those conversations, and are those all underway already?
So those conversations are underway. They started several weeks ago. They are going at different paces with different labor units. Some labor units, the leadership has more authorization to speak on behalf of the membership. Others require more of an iterative process with their frontline membership. The conversations are ongoing. We could not complete those conversations prior to the release of this proposed budget, but I'm hopeful that in the coming weeks, we will resolve those questions before the council has to make final decisions on the adopted budget.
Okay, our next.
So if I could just add that, so the specific date, Jessica, could you remind us what the specific date of the adopted budget is? And then Alex, the short answer to your question is I'd like them concluded prior to that.
Sure. Sure, Mayor. And so actually the next and the biggest step in the process is for council to approve the budget, which is May 20th. The final adoption of the budget is typically the first or the second week of June, and I would have to consult our calendar for the exact date, but it's on our website, the CBO website. The next big step is the approved budget, which is May 20th.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. So our next question is from Julia Silverman with Portland Monthly. She wants to know, Mayor, if you could comment on where Portland fits into the Oregon reopening plan announced today by Governor Kate Brown. And just in the last 30 minutes, Governor Kate Brown, rather an hour ago at 11, she announced a staged approach to reopening. So Julia wants to know what your thoughts are on that.
So I appreciate that, Julia. I have not had the opportunity to see that proposal yet. So I can't comment on it. I will tell you that our Office of Emergency Management and Bureau Directorship and our office have been working closely with the governor's office to make sure that we understand what their proposals are as they issue them. But I haven't had a chance yet to evaluate the press conference that I believe concluded just a few minutes ago.
Okay, our next question is from Keaton Thomas. Keaton.
Hi, so Keaton here with K2 News. Mayor, I guess I have two questions for you. This is just, I guess, one for point of clarity. Can you describe to us how this budget marries with the $114 or so million from the CARES Act? And my understanding is that you can't use the CARES Act funding to go to take on revenue shortfalls, but how do they marry together?
So I'll answer it in reverse order. So yes, you are right. We cannot use.
Hey, Eric, can you start a roll on Camp 14, please? Called Dutch Bros.
So, somebody's ordering coffee, apparently, not me. So you're correct that we cannot use the CARES Act, $114 million allocated to the city of Portland to close any budgetary shortfall. So from a financial perspective, it's not related at all to the city budget. However, from a values perspective, they are in close alignment. As we look at the deployment of the CARES resources, we are thinking fundamentally not just about how to spend those dollars, but how to most cost effectively spend those dollars and how to address the needs of those communities that were hit first and the hardest by the COVID crisis, both from a public health perspective, as well as from an economic and a social perspective. And you already saw the city allocate its first dollars that were not related to the CARE Act towards household stability. Through the Housing Bureau, we allocated $1 million that went to approximately 1,800 different households for things ranging from rent assistance to essential household purposes. And then on the economic development side, you saw our Economic Impact Task Force work with the City Council, Prosper Portland, and private sector partners to provide relief to small businesses. And the first dollars that we pushed out into the community went out towards the Jade District, where even before we were talking about the COVID crisis seriously here in the city of Portland, we were already seeing businesses owned and operated by those entrepreneurs being significantly impacted. So it's my expectation that we will continue to invest resources where the need is the highest, with a focus on equity, with a focus on addressing those communities that were hit first and hardest by this crisis. I think it would be a huge mistake if we go through this crisis and we allow the crisis to exacerbate the inequities that we already see in the community. As I said up front in our budget message, I want to make sure that we're using these resources thoughtfully and intentionally to overcome some of those inequities that have been exacerbated through the COVID crisis.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. The next question is from Maggie Vespa at KGW again. Hey, Maggie.
Hi, guys. So can we just speak a bit more to our housing crisis? We've been hearing, a lot of people are concerned about the crowds that they see out on our streets, and they've been watching, the sort of succession of these new shelters opening up. And they, are just in the back of their minds understand that this crisis still exists. If not, it's being exacerbated by the pandemic. So just, I know obviously we touched on the budget lines that address those, but just kind of the message to the community who might be worried about our unhoused citizens.
Maggie, who's that question for?
Would love Mayor Wheeler to speak to it, but anybody else who feels like they have relevant info, it's great.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. I'm deeply concerned about what is an obvious spike in the homeless crisis, particularly in the city core. One only needs to walk outside and see it for themselves to understand that this is a pervasive crisis, that the COVID crisis is exacerbating the issue. Along with our partners at Multnomah County, we took early steps to open community centers, to open the convention center, and expand our opportunities around sheltering the homeless inside. We also took a very unusual step of opening 3 outside managed campsites that respect the guidance of the CDC in terms of limiting the potential spread of COVID-19 throughout the homeless population. But I share the concern expressed by you and by many others in this community that as we come out of this crisis, we're going to have to continue to redouble our efforts to address the homeless problem. And that's why, despite $75 million in revenue shortfall, we are still holding the Joint Office of Homeless Services whole from a service delivery perspective.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Now, final call for any questions. Remember, we also have our city economist, Josh Harwood. We still have our Bureau Director, Cathy Bless, Chief Human Resource Officer, rather, and we still have Mayor Wheeler, and we have Jessica Kinard to answer any questions. So if you do, let me quickly check the panelist portion of Zoom. We have Keaton Thomas, who has another question. Keaton?
Hello again. Apologies for the Dutch Bros comment behind me on the last time I asked, or last time we talked, but in any case, I'm curious, and this could be a question for Mayor or I guess one of the folks with the budget office, but we're talking about drawing down reserves to be able to fill the gap this year. What sort of position does that set the city in for next year or the years after that? Like, are we going to continue to see a budget and economic crisis at the city level in the years to come?
I think that's a great question for Jessica or Josh, if either of you want to take it.
I can start and then I'll kick it over to Josh because he is the person who closely watches our forecast. We are, as I've said before, in a time of significant uncertainty. So I think, our approach and the reserves that the mayor has drawn upon are the reserves that we know we don't need for the current fiscal year. We know that we're going to know a lot more information in the fall when we take up the fall supplemental budget. We're going to know more information because we're going to know more about our expenditures and how much expenditure we end up incurring as a result of the COVID crisis. But we're also going to know more because the tax filing deadline has been extended until July 15th. So we actually don't have a good picture of what our current year revenues and our next year revenues look like right now, but we'll know a lot more in the fall. And so the approach that we're taking is trying to be really measured and thoughtful and responsible about the reductions that we're taking. drawing on the reserves that we know we don't need next year, knowing that we're going to have to put some of that money back in the 21-22 fiscal year and then in the further years out, but really trying to reduce the harm as much as possible on our current services and our current employees until we really know more about the complete financial picture. Josh, do you have anything to add in terms of what you're looking at when you look forward? Josh, you're on mute.
No, I'm on mute. Sorry, I've been on mute for a while. No, I think you summarized it pretty well. I mean, what we've been doing is I've got a state revenue advisor meeting tomorrow for the state forecast. And so we've got a network of people that we're trying to just learn more every day. But until we get to the other side of this public health crisis, we're just not going to know exactly what that revenue picture looks like. And it's going to be different for different parts of the city too. You know, what we're talking about today is mostly the general fund piece of it, but there will be other pieces that will also be impacted. And we know that now. I mean, transportation's been impacted since there's very little parking and there's very little driving, so the gas taxes dropped. So we know there's different parts of the city that are going to have to be a little different. That's why this is a little more nuanced of an approach, I think, than we're usually used to. We're trying to be nimble and understand that it's going to hit different parts of the city at different times, unlike a financial crisis where everything sort of all kind of hits at the same time. And when that happened in the fiscal year, made it so that it was a little bit easier to probably navigate. This is going to be a little bit more complicated.
Thank you, Josh. That's good. We have a follow-up question from Maggie Bless at KGW. Maggie.
Am I unmuted? There we go. Hey, yeah, so we had one more. This is for Mayor Wheeler. And we've heard from a source just in the last few minutes who said that there's been discussion of closing fire stations, and we know that in the past. And so we're curious, is that in your mind on the table at this point this year?
Maggie, thank you for the question. And the answer is, when we are looking at a budget deficit of this magnitude, literally everything is on the table. So I have not expressed closing fire stations as a priority of this budget. It certainly would not be a priority for me. But as we look at the options that are on the table, everything has to be on the table.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We have one question from Jacqueline Abad. Jacqueline.
Hi, my question is for Mayor Wheeler. You touched on this a little bit earlier in regards to the bureaus. You guys are you're asking them to make some sacrifices. Have you heard have you heard anything from them? Have you talked to them about what cuts they could be making? I know that you're just asking them at this point, but has there been dialogues of what that could look like for them?
Yes, the answer to your question is yes. We are asking all of our employees for sacrifices, myself included, by the way, in order to preserve as many of our frontline services and preserve as many of the jobs of our fellow employees as possible. And we have also opened up dialogues with ways that our bureaus could be more effective. That's the ongoing work that we've been doing over the last year. We've redoubled those efforts, obviously, given the magnitude of the crisis we're experiencing today. I believe a number of the labor organizations were waiting for this proposed budget to be issued so that they could take a look at it. I'm sure they will offer their input and suggestions based on this proposed budget. And I welcome that conversation. Look, our labor leaders are outstanding people. They've worked really hard to find the right path on this budget. So I'm actually very energized by the tone and the content of the conversations we've had so far. They're representing city employees who do great work day in and day out. And we want to honor this process. And we just could not get it wrapped up in time for the delivery of the proposed budget. But now that it's out, we will continue the conversations, and they'll have access to more information about my thinking as we continue those conversations.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Our next question is from Alex Zielinski. She has a follow-up. Hi, Alex.
Thanks for letting us ask so many questions. I have a question about the CARES Act, actually. I just wanted to make sure I understood kind of where that money is right now, where it's going. I know a couple weeks ago, there was still no direction from the US Treasury as to how those dollars can be used or spent. Has the city gotten a better idea of where that money can be used, and where is it right now?
That's a great question for Jessica.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Alex. So we have gotten some follow-up guidance from the Treasury. I think it was about 3 pages of guidance for a very large amount of money. So it was fair. There we still had some questions afterwards after reading the guidance in terms of what can precisely be funded, but generally speaking, it has to go towards COVID response items. It can't go towards revenue supplementation or solving for revenue shortfalls as a result of the crisis. It can go towards things like personal protective equipment and things like food assistance, housing assistance. There are large sort of areas of services that we know the community will be interested in and need resources around. The approach that we've taken at the city is to have a holistic and comprehensive conversation with our council around where their priorities lie and where they would want to see these resources allocated, in concert with conversations that we're having with a number of community partners through our Emergency Coordination Center, as well as with the county, trying to make sure that we can allocate these resources in a way that will be as impactful as possible, knowing that $114 million sounds like a lot of money, but when you're talking about serving the population of Portland and all of the needs that we have in our community, we want to be sure to be really thoughtful and impactful with the resource. So we're going to have a pretty comprehensive conversation again with our council, with community members, with the county and other partners to make sure that those dollars are allocated in a way that is going to do the most good for the people who need it.
All right, thank you, Jessica. Well, I don't see any other hands raised amongst our journalists. So if you have additional questions, you know how to reach me. Thank you so much for joining us for the mayor's proposed budget press conference. And I hope everyone has a great day. And thank you to all our panelists as well.
Thank you, everybody.